If you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention.
It's been exactly 1 year since Game of Thrones ended, and it feels like so much longer than that. The world is in the middle of a pandemic where people have been ordered to stay home for months, and nobody is even considering rewatching what was the biggest show in the history of TV to celebrate the anniversary of its conclusion. Even worse, Game of Thrones completely dropped off the face of the earth the instant that it ended. It's hard to fathom how hard and fast it died, but it happened. For years, Game of Thrones was a Sunday night staple for a lot of people. George R.R. Martin combined terrific characters, wildly interesting storylines, major battles, political intrigue, and elements of fantasy together to create a masterful series that David Benioff and D.B. Weiss did a great job of translating to TV, resulting in some of the most iconic scenes we've ever seen. So how did we get from that to where we ended up? Well, the signs were always there. I don't think there are many people complaining about seasons 1 through 4. Just about everything they tried worked to that point, and it's really the driving force behind how the show turned into the pop culture giant that it became. And then the bad things started to trickle in. And while I don't think season 5 is all that bad, you can start to see the signs of poor writing creeping their way into the story, and by season 6, storylines were really beginning to become streamlined, the writing was falling off rapidly, and the season was mostly just about wasting time to reach the last 2 episodes, because a lot of the people already knew what the end point of the season was. And a lot of these criticisms were dismissed at the time because this show became a victim of its own success. It had become clear that the casual audience was taking over. The show became less about the storytelling that it was built on and more about the spectacle, and even that started to fade down the stretch. Things stopped happening to service the story and started happening to manufacture these big flashy moments, which is what season 7 was built on. It didn't matter that there wasn't any tension, or that the pacing was out of control, or that the storylines weren't making sense within the context of the universe. Whatever had to happen to result in the biggest scenes is what happened. And anytime you voice those criticisms, you are often met with hollow arguments like, oh well, who cares how long it took Khaleesi to fly north of the wall? This show has dragons and zombies in it. Benioff and Weiss didn't care about the context within the universe, and neither did the casual audience. Now look, there's nothing wrong with being a casual fan. It's totally fine if you don't care about any of that stuff and you just want to be entertained. But what made it frustrating for hardcore fans is that the casual fans not only argued against the series' best interests, but they were watching it anyway. There was no reason to streamline the show for the casual fans because they weren't going anywhere. By catering to the casual audience and completely undermining the integrity of the story, Benioff and Weiss managed to both piss off the hardcore fans and destroy the series. Game of Thrones could have been salvaged with a strong final season, and unfortunately, the criticisms that a lot of us had came to fruition in the worst possible way. The series was moving a million miles an hour to get to the finish line, storylines were making zero sense, character arcs were completely dismantled, and the finer details were thrown right out the window. All of the things that made Game of Thrones great were completely gone. For 7 seasons, the White Walkers were a looming and mysterious threat. We knew almost nothing about them, we very rarely got to see them, and they represented both the inevitability of death and the meaninglessness of the feuds between our characters. And with the Long Night, they finally arrived on the scene only to do absolutely nothing. Jon Snow, the prince who was promised and the true heir to the Iron Throne, was finally going to take on the Night King. Everything we hyped up for 8 years was supposed to culminate in that one battle, and a year later, we still have no idea what the White Walkers were doing. We never got to see them actually do anything. Bran's entire place in the story makes absolutely zero sense, and Jon was turned into a glorified background character while Arya received the most unearned moment in history. There was absolutely zero payoff to anything that the series spent years building up to, and it happened to every single piece of the series in one season. So what happened to Game of Thrones? Benioff and Weiss did. I get it. You didn't sign up to finish George's books, but you had to be capable of more than this. And based off of their smug explanations of their abomination of a story, I'm not even sure that they really cared. HBO basically offered to give Game of Thrones an unlimited amount of time and money to finish itself properly, and Benioff and Weiss rejected them. Why? Because it's pretty obvious they wanted to move on and do other things, which thankfully no longer includes Star Wars. And if that's the case, then it's disgraceful that they chose to run the series into the ground rather than give it up to someone who actually cared to finish it the right way. I can mostly grasp where Game of Thrones ended and what George was aiming for, but the way that these two jackasses got there is unspeakably bad. This series desperately needed seasons 7 and 8 to be full seasons, with at least a 9th season on top of it. So 1 year later, how did Game of Thrones reach this point? Look no further than David Benioff and D.B. Weiss.